Everyone wants to change their life. New habits stacked on top of new routines stacked on top of new systems, all piled together like some kind of productivity Jenga tower that collapses by Tuesday. People wake up on January 1st or on a random Monday morning and decide they're going to meditate, journal, exercise, read 50 books, take cold showers, practice gratitude, do breath work, and eat clean all at the same time. And then they're shocked when none of it sticks. Here's what nobody talks about. The people who actually transform the way they think, the ones who walk into a room differently, who respond to chaos differently, who seem like they've been rewired from the inside out, most of them didn't do all of it. They picked one thing, one single practice, and they committed to it for 21 days like their sanity depended on it. Sounds almost too simple, right? But there's a reason neuroscientists keep coming back to the 21-day window. That's roughly how long it takes for a repeated behavior to start carving new neural pathways, not just as a habit, but as a fundamental shift in how the brain processes information. After 3 weeks of consistent practice, the brain doesn't just do the thing automatically. It starts thinking differently about everything else too. This isn't about building a morning routine or optimizing a schedule. This is about choosing a single mental practice that within 21 days will change the architecture of your thoughts. Not the surface-level thoughts about what to eat for lunch or whether to reply to that email. The deep architecture. The patterns that determine how a person responds to failure, to uncertainty, or to the gap between who they are and who they want to become. And there are 8 practices that have the power to do this. 8 different entry points into a fundamentally different way of thinking. But the rule is absolute. Pick only one. There's an old story about Miyamoto Musashi, arguably the greatest swordsman who ever lived. The man fought over 60 duels and never lost a single one. 60. 0 losses. And when people asked him what his secret was, he didn't rattle off a list of techniques or talk about cross-training or optimizing his schedule. He said something that translates roughly to, do nothing which is of no use. Strip away everything that doesn't matter. Find the one thing that does, and do it until it becomes part of your bones. Here's the thing about the modern self-improvement world. It operates on the exact opposite philosophy. More books, more courses, more habits, more tools. The assumption is that transformation comes from accumulation, that if 10 minutes of meditation is good, then 10 minutes of meditation plus journaling, plus breathwork, plus gratitude lists, plus cold exposure, plus reading, plus affirmations must be 10 times better. But the brain doesn't work like that, not even close. When researchers at University College London tracked habit formation, they found something fascinating. Participants who focused on a single behavioral change reached automaticity, the point where the behavior required almost no conscious effort, in an average of 66 days. But here's the part nobody quotes. Participants who tried to change multiple behaviors simultaneously showed almost no progress on any of them after the same period. The cognitive load of managing multiple new behaviors essentially canceled out the neuroplastic benefits of each individual one. Think of it like sunlight through a magnifying glass. Diffused light warms a surface slightly. Focused light starts a fire. Same amount of energy, completely different result. The people who change their lives in a matter of weeks aren't doing more than everyone else. They're doing less, but with total, undivided cognitive investment. There's a reason that every major philosophical and martial tradition throughout history arrived at the same conclusion independently. The samurai called it Ichigo Ichi-e, one encounter, one opportunity, total presence applied to a single thing. The Stoics practiced prososh, continuous unwavering attention to one's governing principle. Buddhist monks don't rotate through 12 practices per day. They sit. That's it. They sit, And they do it with such sustained focus that the simple act of sitting becomes the vehicle for profound cognitive transformation. So the first rule is the hardest one for most people to accept. You have to choose. One practice, not two, not 1.5. One. But that creates an obvious problem because there are 8 of them, and the wrong choice means 3 wasted weeks. So before getting into the practices themselves, there's something critical to understand about why 21 days is the threshold, and why most people quit around day 8. Nobody tells you about day 8. Every book, every guru, every motivational video talks about starting. They talk about day 1, energy, and the finish line. But nobody prepares anyone for the part in the middle where the brain actively fights against the change. Here's what happens neurologically. For the first 5 to 7 days of a new mental practice, the brain is essentially in novelty mode. Dopamine levels are slightly elevated just from the newness of the experience. Everything feels fresh. A person sits down to practice and thinks, "This is it. I can feel it working already." Then, around day 8, the novelty wears off. Dopamine drops back to baseline, and suddenly the practice feels pointless, boring, like it's not doing anything at all. This is where things get tricky, because that feeling of nothing is happening is actually the most important phase of the entire process. Neuroscientists call it the consolidation phase, the period where the brain is quietly reorganizing neural connections in response to the repeated behavior. It's like renovating a house. The demolition is exciting, the finished product is exciting, but the weeks in between where it's just dust and exposed wiring and nothing looks different, that's when the actual structural work is happening. The people who push through day 8, who keep showing up when it feels flat and purposeless, are the ones who hit day 15 and suddenly realize they responded to a stressful email differently than they would have 3 weeks ago. They notice they didn't spiral after a piece of bad news. They catch themselves observing a thought instead of being consumed by it. That's the rewiring. And it only happens on the other side of the wall. Pretty clever design by the brain, actually. It tests commitment before it agrees to change. From an evolutionary perspective, the brain doesn't want to rewire itself for every passing whim. It wants proof that this new behavior is going to stick around before it invests the metabolic energy required to build new pathways. So, whatever practice gets chosen, the commitment isn't to enjoy it for 21 days. The commitment is to do it for 21 days whether it feels like it's working or not. Now, the 8 practices. The first is directed silence. This isn't meditation, not exactly. Meditation has become such a loaded word that it's almost useless, because people hear it and picture monks on mountaintops or apps with soothing voices telling them to imagine a beach. Directed silence is different. 15 minutes per day, no phone, no music, no audiobook, no background noise if it can be avoided. Sit somewhere and do nothing. But the directed part is key. The only task is to notice when the mind starts narrating. Not to stop it, not to judge it, just to notice it. That's the whole practice. Sounds ridiculously simple, right? But try it for 3 days, and something strange starts happening. Most people discover that they cannot sit in silence for more than about 90 seconds before their brain generates a thought urgent enough to make them want to reach for their phone. Military survival training teaches something similar. When soldiers are put through resistance training, the ones who perform best aren't the ones who feel no fear. They're the ones who can observe the fear without obeying it. Directed silence builds that same capability for everyday life. After 21 days, stressful situations feel like they have a buffer zone around them. The event happens, and instead of an immediate emotional reaction, there's a half-second pause. That half-second changes everything, because it's the difference between firing off an angry email and taking a breath first, between spiraling into anxiety and recognizing the spiral as it starts. One guy who spent 12 years in high-frequency trading described it this way. Before the practice, his thoughts felt like a fire hose aimed at his face, and after 21 days they felt more like a river he was watching from the bank. Same thoughts, same volume, completely different relationship to them. Directed silence works best for people whose primary problem is reactivity. For anyone who reacts before they think and constantly puts out fires, they accidentally started with their own emotional responses. But reactivity isn't everyone's problem, which brings us to the second practice, exhaustive writing. Some people don't need to quiet their minds, they need to empty them. There's a difference. Directed silence trains observation, but exhaustive writing trains extraction, pulling thoughts out of the head and putting them somewhere external where they can be examined. The practice works like this. Every morning, before doing anything else, before checking a phone, before coffee, before conversation, sit down and write by hand for 20 minutes straight. Not typing, writing. And the rule is simple. The pen never stops moving. If there's nothing to write, write, "I have nothing to write," over and over until something surfaces. It always does. This isn't journaling in the traditional sense. There's no prompt, no structure, no gratitude list. It's a purge, a stream of consciousness with absolutely no filter and no audience. The human brain generates somewhere around 6,000 thoughts per day, and the vast majority of those thoughts are repetitive. The same worries and narratives and mental loops running on repeat like a song stuck on a broken record. When a recurring thought gets put on paper, something shifts. The brain seems to recognize that the thought has been handled and stops serving it up on repeat. Experienced practitioners of this technique figured out something that researchers later confirmed. The repetitive thoughts that dominate the first 3 or 4 days of writing gradually fade, and by day 10 the writing starts accessing deeper material, and by day 15 insights start surfacing that feel genuinely new. A therapist who recommends this practice to clients describes what happens around day 17 as hitting the aquifer, where the surface water of daily worries has been drained away, and what's underneath is clearer, sometimes uncomfortable, but always more true. This practice has to be done by hand rather than by typing, because handwriting is slower, and that forced slowness creates a bottleneck that pushes deeper material to the surface. While the motor cortex activation involved in handwriting engages areas associated with memory consolidation and emotional processing that keyboard use simply doesn't activate. Exhaustive writing works best for people whose primary issue is mental overload, the ones who lie awake at night with racing thoughts and feel overwhelmed not by external circumstances, but by the sheer volume of internal noise. The third practice is deliberate discomfort. Some people don't need to observe their thoughts or empty them. They need to prove to themselves that their thoughts are wrong. There's a pattern that affects millions of people that goes something like this. A person wants to do something, start a business, have a difficult conversation, make a real change, and their brain immediately generates a wall of thoughts explaining why it's too hard, so too risky, too uncomfortable, too likely to fail. And the person treats those thoughts as facts rather than the unreliable predictions they actually are. Deliberate discomfort is the practice of systematically proving to the brain that its threat assessments are wildly inaccurate. If this idea of deliberate discomfort resonates with you, the KMA method was built exactly for that. A focused system to train discipline through action, not motivation, in just 5 minutes a day. The link is in the pinned comment. Every single day for 21 days, do one thing that creates genuine discomfort. Not danger, not recklessness, discomfort. Week 1 might be small, like talking to a stranger, eating lunch alone at a restaurant without a phone, or asking for a discount at a store. Week 2 escalates to sharing an unpopular opinion in a meeting, calling someone instead of texting, or admitting ignorance about something publicly. Week 3 goes further. having the conversation that's been avoided for months, submitting the application, making the ask. The key isn't the discomfort itself, but the cognitive data that the discomfort generates, because every time a person does something uncomfortable and survives, every time the predicted catastrophe doesn't materialize, the brain is forced to update its threat model. Veterans of this practice describe a specific moment, usually around day 14, where they suddenly realize that the voice in their head predicting disaster has been wrong every single time. Not sometimes, every time. And once a person genuinely understands that their brain's threat assessments are unreliable, it changes how they respond to every fear-based thought that follows. A former combat medic who now works as an executive coach puts it this way: courage is what happens when you've generated enough evidence that fear is a bad advisor. After that, it's just making decisions without consulting someone you don't trust anymore. This practice works best for people whose primary issue is avoidance, whose lives are shaped more by what they're running from than what they're running toward. The fourth practice is single-task immersion, and it attacks a problem that most people don't even recognize as a problem. The modern brain has been trained to split its attention so constantly and so thoroughly that most people have literally forgotten what full concentration feels like. Research on attention fragmentation shows that the average person switches tasks or checks a different input every 3 to 4 minutes throughout their working day, and every single switch carries a cognitive cost that takes anywhere from 10 to 23 minutes to fully recover from. Simple math, really. If someone switches attention 20 times an hour and each switch costs even 5 minutes of recovery, the brain is spending its entire day trying to catch up with itself. Single-task immersion means choosing one activity per day and giving it absolutely undivided attention for a minimum of 45 minutes. No phone in the room, no music, no second screen, no background anything. Just one task and total presence with it. This could be work, reading, cooking, even cleaning. The activity itself doesn't matter. What matters is the quality of attention brought to it. After about a week of this, something strange happens. The activity starts revealing layers that scattered attention never could. People report that work they found boring suddenly becomes interesting. The tasks they dreaded start feeling almost meditative, that their capacity for sustained thought physically expands. It's like discovering that a television they've been watching in standard definition their entire life actually has a high-definition mode that nobody told them about. One software developer described it as suddenly being able to hold entire systems in my head instead of just fragments. This practice works best for anyone who feels scattered, who starts things but rarely finishes them, who constantly feels busy but never feels productive. The fifth practice is what might be called the evening audit, and it's probably the most overlooked of all 8. Every night for 10 to 15 minutes, sit down and mentally replay the day from beginning to end. Not to judge it, but to observe it. What triggered emotional reactions? What decisions were made on autopilot? Where did behavior align with intentions and where did it diverge? The key is to approach the review with the detachment of a scientist examining data rather than a judge passing sentence. The power of this practice is that it turns unconscious patterns into conscious data. Most people live their days on autopilot and never examine why they reacted the way they did or why they made the choices they made. The evening audit creates a feedback loop that doesn't exist naturally. After about 2 weeks, practitioners start noticing patterns they've been running for years without awareness, repeating cycles they never saw, triggers they never identified, and autopilot decisions that were quietly steering their lives in directions they never consciously chose. One executive who practiced this for 21 days said she discovered she'd been making every major decision in her career based on a fear she developed at age 12 that she'd never consciously acknowledged. Another practitioner, a teacher, realized he'd been avoiding conflict with a specific colleague for 3 years because of a dynamic that reminded him of an unresolved relationship from his 20s, something he'd never connected until the pattern emerged from 2 weeks of nightly review. The evening audit works best for people who feel like their life is happening to them rather than being directed by them, who keep ending up in the same situations and can't figure out why. The sixth practice is deliberate solitude, which is different from directed silence. Directed silence is about observing the mind in stillness, but deliberate solitude is about spending extended time alone without any input at all. No screens, no books, no podcasts, no music, nothing. 1 full hour per day. This sounds extreme in a world where most people haven't spent 60 consecutive minutes without external stimulation since childhood, and that's exactly why it works. The brain that's constantly receiving input never has to generate its own content, and a brain that never generates its own content gradually loses the ability to do so, like a muscle that atrophies from disuse. Deliberate solitude forces the mind to become its own source of stimulation, and what emerges after the initial restlessness passes is remarkable. People report a return of genuine creativity that they thought they'd lost, the resurfacing of long-buried insights and ideas, and a dramatic reduction in the need for external validation and entertainment. A writer who had been struggling with creative block for over 2 years tried this practice and described what happened around day 12. I stopped needing ideas to come from somewhere. They started generating themselves, like a spring that had been blocked with debris and suddenly cleared. After 21 days, the relationship with solitude itself transforms from something to be avoided into something that feels genuinely nourishing. This practice works best for people who can't be alone with their own thoughts, who reach for their phone the moment there's a quiet moment, who feel anxious or restless without constant stimulation. The seventh practice is physical stillness, which addresses the connection between body and mind in a way that none of the other practices do. For 20 minutes per day, sit completely still. Not meditating, not breathing exercises, just stillness. No fidgeting, no adjusting, no scratching, no shifting weight. Complete physical immobility while remaining fully awake and aware. Here's the thing about this practice that makes it so powerful. The urge to move is one of the most primal impulses the brain generates, and learning to observe that urge without obeying it builds a capacity for impulse control that transfers to every other area of life. The body wants to fidget. The mind says, move, and the practitioner simply notices the urge and stays still. The first few days are almost comically difficult. An itch appears on the nose and suddenly it's the most important itch in the history of itches, absolutely demanding to be scratched. The knee aches and the brain insists that permanent damage will result if the position isn't adjusted immediately. The brain will generate increasingly creative and urgent reasons why movement is absolutely necessary right now. And observing those fabrications without obeying them is itself a masterclass in understanding how the mind manufactures false urgency about everything, not just physical discomfort. After 21 days of this, people report a fundamental shift in their relationship with impulses of all kinds, not just physical ones. The urge to check a phone, the urge to interrupt someone, the urge to eat when not hungry, the urge to respond in anger. All of these impulses start feeling less like commands and more like suggestions that can be acknowledged and then calmly declined. One recovering addict who practices physical stillness credits it with giving him a capability he never had before: the ability to feel a craving fully without acting on it. "I used to think cravings were emergencies," he said. "Now I know they're just loud suggestions with an expiration date." This practice works best for people whose primary issue is impulsivity, who act before they think, who know what they should do but consistently do something else in the moment. The eighth and final practice is gratitude narration. but not the kind that shows up in self-help books where someone scribbles 3 things they're grateful for and moves on with their day. That version of gratitude practice has been so watered down by popular culture that it barely registers as a cognitive exercise anymore. This version is different and far more demanding. For 10 minutes each morning, narrate out loud, in full sentences, the specific reasons why particular things in life are valuable. Not "I'm grateful for my health," but a detailed verbal exploration of exactly why health matters, what it enables, what its absence would mean, what specific moments it made possible yesterday. The narration has to be spoken aloud because vocalization activates different neural circuits than silent thought, and the specificity requirement forces the brain out of generic appreciation and into genuine cognitive engagement with the texture of lived experience. Most people resist this one at first because it feels performative, like talking to an empty room about things that should be obvious. But the discomfort is the point. The brain's default negativity bias, the evolutionary tendency to scan for threats rather than appreciate what's already working, is so deeply wired that overriding it requires active, sustained, almost aggressive counter-programming. Silent gratitude lists don't generate enough neural activation to compete with the negativity bias. Spoken detailed narration does. After about 2 weeks, something shifts that practitioners consistently describe as a change in default perception. The brain starts automatically noticing value in situations where it previously noticed only problems. Not through forced positivity or denial of difficulty, but through a genuine expansion of what the attentional system considers relevant. Experienced practitioners describe it as going from seeing the world in grayscale to seeing it in color, where the color was always there, but the brain had learned to filter it out. One combat veteran with severe trauma described the practice as the first thing that changed what I saw when I opened my eyes in the morning. Not what I thought about what I saw, but what I actually noticed first. This practice works best for people whose default mental state is negative, who see problems before possibilities, who feel like life is something to be endured rather than experienced. Now comes the hardest part, because the temptation after hearing all 8 is almost irresistible. Combine them. Do a little silence, a little writing, a little discomfort. Mix and match like a self-improvement buffet. Don't. Each of these practices works through a different neurological mechanism, and trying to activate multiple mechanisms simultaneously is like trying to renovate every room of a house at the same time with a single contractor. Everything takes 3 times as long and nothing gets done properly. The choice comes down to honest self-assessment, and honesty is the operative word because most people will instinctively gravitate toward the practice they need least. The person who needs deliberate discomfort will choose directed silence because it's safer. The person who needs physical stillness will choose exhaustive writing because at least they're doing something. The practice to choose is the one that creates the most internal resistance, the one where the immediate thought is anything but that. That resistance is the brain protecting the exact pattern that needs to change. And here's the part that makes this whole framework more powerful than it appears on the surface. After 21 days of a single focused practice, the cognitive changes start bleeding into areas that were never directly targeted. People who practice directed silence report that their writing improves, not because they practiced writing, but because observing thoughts clearly naturally produces clearer communication. People who practice exhaustive writing become more comfortable with discomfort, because mental clarity makes fear-based thoughts easier to dismiss. People who practice physical stillness find their minds becoming quieter without ever meditating. It's as if the cognitive system has a bottleneck, one primary dysfunction creating cascading problems everywhere else, and removing that bottleneck allows everything downstream to flow more freely. This is why Musashi's philosophy works. Not because doing less is inherently virtuous, but because the human cognitive system responds to depth, not breadth. One practice done with absolute consistency for 21 days produces more transformation than 8 practices done at half effort for 6 months. So here's the question that matters. Not, which practice should I choose? Because that answer should already be forming. The real question is simpler and harder. Can you commit to one thing, just one thing, for 21 days, even when it stops feeling like it's working? There's an old parable about a student who visits a master and asks how long it will take to achieve mastery. The master says 10 years. The student asks what if he works twice as hard, and the master replies 20 years. The student, confused, asks what if he dedicates every waking moment, and the master says, then he will never achieve it, because a person with one eye on the destination has only one eye left for the path. The 21-day practice works the same way. The ones who transform are the ones who forget about the destination entirely, who sit down on day 9, the day after the wall, the day when it all feels pointless, and do the practice anyway. Not because they believe it's working, not because they feel inspired, but because they made a decision and they're the kind of person who honors their own decisions. That, by the way, is the real transformation. Not the neural pathways, not the cognitive restructuring, not the improved emotional regulation. Those are all real and all valuable. But the deepest change is simpler than any of that. It's becoming someone who says they'll do something and then does it, even when it's boring, even when it's uncomfortable, even when nobody is watching and there's no immediate reward. 21 days, one practice, that's it. The only question left is which one makes you the most uncomfortable to start. That's your answer.